and welcome to another session of Karen's Colours. I'm Dr. Karen and these are my colour conversations. This week I'll be looking at green in terms of its history as a basic colour term and its rather checkered past in terms of how it has been perceived. As well as that, we'll be working through some of the idioms that we use these days in order to describe what we feel about green. But before I begin, once again, I'd like to thank all of you who've been coming in and watching my videos. And if you're new to the channel, you are doubly welcome. I hope you enjoy what you're finding here and are able to garner some new information that you might just find interesting in your everyday conversations. Above all, if you like what you hear, please give it a like, maybe subscribe, and most importantly, leave a comment so that I've got some idea of how you feel about the topic. So let's get started. Let's begin with an overview. Green has an incredibly wide variety of hues, many more so than we've actually got names for. It is in the middle of the spectrum that we know of today that our eyes can see best. Our perception is extremely acute in these areas. The ability to differentiate between coloured berries against a background of green leaves has been critical for our survival over generations. The colour changes in leaves and fruits and vegetables can offer us warnings that something may be edible, or it may be poisonous, or it may even be rotten. So these have been very important indicators environmentally for those of us that were around in the very early days of humankind. There is less strain on our eyes to perceive green, and that means that our nervous system is able to relax. Therefore, we tend to use green on the walls of hospitals and schools and various work environments where high stress is likely to be a factor in working in those environments. Specifically in theatres, we wear green surgical gowns and have green drapes. This is not only to relax the mind, but it also offers the opportunity to disguise the appearance of blood and to reduce the reactions we have to blood being splattered around in that environment. In the past, actors and actresses have had access to what were called green rooms to help them to relax after the bright lights on stage and also to help them to relax before they actually went on stage. These days, of course, we don't necessarily paint those rooms green, but there is still a certain amount of green that is left in the rooms in order to help relax the minds of those people who are inhabiting them. There is an interesting feature of natural environments in that it has been discovered that they actually aid longevity. There is a 12% lower death rate among those people who live in rural environments, particularly in very heavily green environments, as to those who live in urban environments where there is very little green. In fact, green is noted to be beneficial to mental health. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everything about green is good. There are reversals of values that we attribute to the colour that are quite common. And because it has been difficult to create it as a natural dye because it is chemically unstable, it was one of the later colours that were named as a basic colour term in our colour lexicon. Nevertheless, 1 in 6 people favour green as their best liked colour. 1 in 10 Westerners won't wear it though. And this is an interesting aspect of the colour green, particularly among males. Yet it is much more favoured in non-Anglo cultures where green is considered to be a colour of fertility and good luck. So let's now move on to the history of the colour green. In the Paleolithic era, there is no occurrence of green whatsoever in art or artefacts, but it appears very early amongst the Egyptians, where green was obtained by the crushing of the ore malachite. and it was used extensively in the production of funeral sarcophagi. The earth god Geb and the god Osiris are both depicted as green-skinned creatures. The earth god had the power to grow and regenerate food. He was also involved in fecundity, that is fertility, and the ability to maintain a pregnancy. Osiris, on the other hand, was associated with his ability to have victory over diseases and victory over evil, as well as permitting resurrection into an afterlife. In Grecian information, the green colour was actually considered to be indistinguishable from blue, yellow, grey or brown in their language. That doesn't mean they didn't actually notice it, because it was a colour associated very much with barbarian people, and that proceeded to continue into the Roman Empire. And here in the early Roman Empire, it was associated with all things that needed to be conquered. Sports chariots in Rome were also considered to be very lucky if they were green, and more often than not they painted the chariots green or gave some sort of green livery to the horses. Blue was the colour of the Senate and patrician teams, and green the colour of the populace. Interestingly, green chariots tend to win more races than blue chariots did. In watching these various different competitions required long hours of sitting out in the bright sun. And we have recordings that Emperor Nero sat with a green emerald that he could stare into to relax his eyes and soothe them after having watched both the chariot races and gladiators perform. It was adopted as a colour for clothing in the late Roman Empire, but this was only after barbarians had begun to infiltrate into those regions that were previously held by the Romans exclusively. In Eastern cultures, by contrast, their traditions included quite a number of greens. It was more socially important because it was associated with paradise. It was considered to be the dynastic colour of Muhammad and chosen because it contrasted well against the white and red of the Crusaders that they were fighting against. But there is no actual evidence to provide that this was the case. Nevertheless, green was adopted as the Islamic flag over the centuries, and in more recent times, it has come to adorn the minarets of Islamic communities. The Vikings, too, had green as a very common colour that they used in their clothing. It represented for them vegetation, spring, the sky, and also paradise. In medieval Europe, that is between the 5th and 12th centuries CE, colours were limited to what could be created by natural dyes. And we already know that green was a very unstable dye, so it didn't tend to appear prominently. It was, however, considered to be the middle colour among the three major colours, black, white and red, where red was considered to be the opposite of black as well as the opposite of white. Black and white were not considered to be opposites or complementary. So green was the colour in the middle, and because of that, it was associated with the heart. It was decried as the colour of madness and worn by jesters along with yellow. So yellow and green were very common colours for such people's occupations. But as the medieval era, or the Middle Ages, as they're sometimes called, progressed, we found that green became the colour that was adorned by young women and older ones hoping for maternity. And indeed, when their children were born, they were often swaddled in green cloths to help them preserve their lives and in the hope that they would live long and fruitful lives. By the 11th century, there was very little recognition in art, religion, or social life with the colour green. Water, however, was associated as a green object, and eventually the religion decided that ghosts and goblins and imps and sprites were all associated with green. That is, they were the sorts of spirits that were likely to do evil to humankind and so therefore were shunned. Later on in that same period, the nature spirits embodied in the green man were taken on as the types of characters that could be emulated by those people who wanted to live a more natural life. And to this day, we still have celebration of the green man in some parts of Europe and particularly in parts of England. By the 12th century, green had begun to penetrate into the heraldic practices in Europe, but only 5% of heraldry was associated with green. But you will notice that most of the heraldry of this period contrasted green with yellow rather than, as we do today, green contrasting with red. At this time also, we found a number of young men who would clad themselves or their horses in green livery, and these were called the Green Knights. They were generally considered to be young, adventurous, intrepid, spirited, and fairly impetuous, and therefore more likely to be killed or injured in jousting. By the 13th and 14th centuries, when the Crusades were in full swing, the idea of green became attached to devils. And this is very likely to be as a result of an anti-Islamist movement in Europe. In the 15th century, these ideas of devils had expanded to incorporate dragons, which were also associated with anything that was slimy, pustular, gleaming, nauseating, venomous, hypocritical, and cruel. As well as this, green was also becoming associated with those things that cause disease, things like mold and putrefaction and decaying flesh. But there were geographical differences in the way in which green was perceived socially. In Germany, for example, green was associated with nobility and wealth, whereas in France, it was associated with insanity and an unsound mind. When we arrive in the 16th century, we find that green is associated with witches and witchcraft. They also were associated with fairies, who, if they were displeased, would actually bewitch people or steal their children. And as a result of these beliefs, anyone with green-coloured eyes was also considered to be an evil person. And there was an old saying then that green eyes will send their owner to hell. Nevertheless, green was a very handy colour for those who had the jobs of being hunters, because it allowed them to camouflage themselves within the areas in which they hunted. Bandits also tended to adopt green, again for the same camouflage purposes. Then green became associated with money, not because money itself was green, but because money exchanges and money counters often used green baize cloths on which to count their money, because such cloths allowed for easy differentiation between the colour of the background and the colour of the coins themselves. As well as this, green began to be used as a dye. And here we have a differentiation between what was classified as the gay greens, which were all vibrant, bright, and visually exciting to look at, and the lost greens, those which were dull and dark visually. By the 17th century, green had once again lost some of its value. It was no longer considered to be a main colour. It was now seen as a secondary colour because it had been established through the dye makers' trades that it could be made from the addition of yellow and blue. Thus, it was religiously decried, particularly amongst Protestants, who thought that these colours, the colour green, was improper, gaudy, irreligious, and impious, to the extent that the association of green with improper conduct and danger actually went into superstitions. The first of these was that if you had green on stage, the show itself would have bad luck. Boats that were painted green attracted storms, and there was a risk of lightning strike and, of course, fire, to the extent that at one stage in England, All boats that had been painted green were destroyed so that the people who sailed upon whatever was left of the fleet would be kept safe. If you wore green to a wedding, you were going to give bad luck to the couple. That, of course, doesn't occur anymore now. In fact, green is a very common colour for bridesmaids at a wedding. Someone who wore a green bonnet was considered to be a fraud, a bankrupt, someone who falsely indebted themselves without any intention of repaying those debts. And interesting, even today, the New York Fraud Department wears green caps. But the biggest problem was that green dye was poisonous. And it wasn't until Newton resurrected green as a legitimate colour within the spectrum that it began to get some positive connotations again. By the mid-18th century, green had regained its stature as a colour of nature, health, peace, quiet, and of aspirations, and barn doors were painted green in order to keep the livestock within safe. But blue and green were not considered to be particularly happy together as colours to be worn in the same set of garments. And the idea of complementarity theory had begun to make its way into consciousness. So green moved from its opposition to the colour yellow to becoming the opposite of the colour red. By the 19th century, this complementarity theory gave rise to signalling systems within ports that allowed for a green signal to be given when the path was clear for a ship to enter a port, and the red signal was given as an indicator that it was no longer safe. In fact, these days we still have lights of green and red on either side of a ship to indicate to oncoming people, particularly in the dark, which side of the ship is facing them, and so therefore what direction they're likely to be travelling. In England and in most British colony countries, the House of Lords or the upper house have their benches clad in red, whereas the lower house, that is the House of Commons or the House of Representatives in places like Australia, their benches are green. As green became more favourable, the idea of liberty and fashion arose again, and green became very fashionable. The trouble was, though, that they continued to create dyes made from some very dangerous substances. For example, copper shavings dissolved in arsenic was a very good way of creating a colour green. Iodine green, methyl green, and almond green, all of these colours gave different shades and depths of green, and all of them were toxic. Thus, with the invention of artificial dyes, we began to see a movement away from such toxic items. By the 20th century, though, green was considered to be pretty useless, and it became a colour associated with toys such as tin cars, tin soldiers, and also the clothing of various different dolls. It then was adopted as a colour of uniforms, and here we have quite a number of different varieties of green, including, in the bottom image there, a camouflage outfit which comprises of green as well as browns and yellows, which make it very difficult to differentiate the wearer from the environment in which they might be hiding. During this time also, we created some fairly acid-looking greens and also khaki greens, which became very popular, particularly in the post-World War II era. In modern times, of course, we also developed films. Lots of them were associated with science fiction because that was something of great interest to a big part of the population. And so we developed the idea of little green men, that is, people from Mars that were out to invade us here on Earth. Later on in the 20th century, however, green became affiliated with a political movement known as the environmentalists or the greenies. And now in the 21st century, we also have what is known as the Green New Deal. in the United States. We don't quite have that here in Australia, but our green parties across the world are very, very slowly beginning to increase their voter backing. So what then does this do to our concepts of green? Well, the positive concepts of green are all associated with life, luck, hope, and destiny. In fact, we have certain plants that we consider to be lucky. Shamrock, the lucky bamboo, and also the green jade plant, all of which are supposed to attract fortune and money. But green is also associated with childhood, with changeability, with things that are fleeting, that move from season to season and become something different. They're associated with nature, with freedom, with ecology, with health. And we know that most green foods are extremely healthy for us, even if we don't eat a great deal of them. But also hygiene and sports are associated with green activities. And an orchard gives us pleasure and relaxation. It also is a symbol of conservation of the planet. But that's just in the Western world. In the Eastern world as well, green continues and has done so for centuries to be the harbinger of divine love. And here we have Krishna and his ability to create divine love amongst the human race. But negative connotations continue. Green is still associated with poison. It's associated with evil and madness and disorders of all kind. It's also associated with anything that is unstable and capricious. So we have unpleasantness and inconstancy, duplicity, betrayal, treachery, falseness, fickleness, and frivolity. Boredom, envy, greed, selfishness, and sickness, all associated with the colour green. In fact, green and impatience are so much associated with the idea of greed that it is easy to see that the bull markets of our economic systems across the world could quite easily be clad in green. Of course, the actual statue sitting outside the New York Stock Exchange is not green, but it could be because it represents all those things that are negative. There is also the idea of being green behind the ears. Now, this is an old saying, one that involves the idea of a person who is utterly clueless as to the reality of things going on in their environments. So let's now move on to some positive green idioms. A green thumb means that someone has a natural skill for gardening. Green light gives you permission to proceed. Green collar work is environmentally conscious design, policy, or technology. Rub of the green is a British type of saying that actually involves a lot of sports where touching green grass during that sporting event is considered to be good luck. Emerald glasses, and this particular pair cost over $3.5 million because they are actual emeralds and actual diamonds, are considered to ward off evil. And you'll find that many sunglasses are also given a green hue for that very same reason. And of course, the last one is the green card, which gives people who entered the United States permanent residency and also the right to work. Negative green idioms, on the other hand, are all to do with ideas of envy, resentfulness, bitterness, jealousy, and the green-eyed monster is considered to be the ultimate in the way of an envious person. So the idea of green eyes being associated with negativity still persists even after all those centuries. Being green about the gills means an appearance of being ill, and it is associated with travellers' illnesses known as the green apple quick step, not talking about the group that called themselves that, but it has to do with travellers' diarrhea. Shipping them green is a seaman's term which refers to worsening weather, danger, or unsatisfactory situations. The idea that you shouldn't buy green bananas means that you shouldn't be making long-term plans, as you may not live long enough to see them come to fruition. Greenwashing is a claim by companies that they have an environmental credential that is most undeserved. And wearing the green willow is the idea of being depressed, particularly as a result of some form of unrequited love or mourning for a lost love. But there are also neutral terms associated with green. A green hand or a greenhorn is an inexperienced worker. Greener on the other side of the fence has to do with aspirations. It always seems to be easier. It always seems to be more prosperous where you are not, rather than where you are. Going green means that a person is or is perceived as being environmentally friendly. The greenback refers to the United States currency, whereas green folding stuff also refers to money, but not necessarily just US money. And finally, God's green earth means anywhere and everywhere. So what have we learnt from the colour green? Green became a basic colour term after the Roman era. Once the barbarians had taken over, it was then incorporated into the language. It was decried as a colour by Western culture and lauded by Eastern culture for many centuries thereafter. It is still a fairly popular colour between both men and women, but it has more negative than positive idioms. And more recently, green has developed strong political connotations that make it both loathed and loved. So what would you like to say about the colour green? I invite you to leave some comments. Next time, we'll be going back to looking at another film, and after that, I'll be examining how to create a green personality. So hopefully you'll stick around for those. Until then, I wish you luck and fortune and all things good from the colour green.